In Racing Through Time, we look at the drivers, the cars, the races and the circuits that made motorsport history. The history of Italian motor racing is full of world-famous marques. One of the most fascinating, with a long history of success, is Maserati. The company built Grand Prix cars, voiturettes and sports cars, and achieved considerable success in each category. A 4CL Maserati at historic Goodwood, one of the many cars that were sold by the Maserati brothers to private owners during a long history making and selling racing cars. Their most famous car was the 250F. Their last successful racing car was the Birdcage sports car. Only once did Maserati win the World Championship with a works team. The 250F in 1957, driven by Juan Manuel Fangio, was the last successful Grand Prix Maserati. In 1966 and 1967, Cooper used the V12 Maserati engine to power their Grand Prix car to 2 World Championship victories. Maserati has a long and interesting sporting history, which was unbroken over 3 decades. The Maserati trident emblem comes from Neptune's statue in Bologna. The company grew out of a tuning shop, which 3 of the Maserati brothers, Alfieri, Bindo and Ernesto, built up in Bologna. Their first car, the Maserati Tipo 26, was based on a 2-litre Diato, reduced to 1492cc with an 8-cylinder twin-overhead camshaft engine. It made its racing debut at the Targa Florio in 1926, winning the class. A radical new design in 1929, called the V4, had a V16 made up of 2 straight-8 engines on a common crankcase. This 4-litre engine developed 280 brake horsepower at 5,200 RPM. In 1930, Borzacchini won the Tripoli Grand Prix. In 1933, the 8C3000 and the 8CM3000 were built, with a 3-litre 8-cylinder engine. Campari won the French Grand Prix at Montlhéry. And when Nuvolari returned from Alfa Romeo to Maserati, he won the Belgian Grand Prix, the Coppechiano and the Nice Grand Prix. Maserati made sports cars and small-capacity racing cars, as well as Grand Prix cars. Maserati and Alfa race around Monaco. At this time, motor racing was very much a rich amateur's sport. In order to do so successfully, you had to have the right equipment and have it properly prepared. This 8CM Maserati was originally purchased by Anglo-American Whitney Straight from the factory, typical of the wealthy private owners of the 1930s who went racing. The white mouse represented Siamese Prince Chula Chakrabonsa's team, which he set up for his cousin Prince Bira later in the car's career. The definitive version of the 3000cc Grand Prix car and replacement for the 8C 2800 and 8C 3000 was the Tipo 8CM. Using the engine from the 8C 3000 and the frame concept and suspension system developed for the 4CM 1100, these developments came together in the single-seater, the 8CM. In original form, the 8CM developed 225 brake horsepower at 5,500 RPM through its supercharged straight 8-cylinder engine. C stands for cylinder and M for monoposto or single-seater. Maserati, Alfa Romeo and Bugatti were the major companies who produced racing cars. Bugatti was from France. Britain had larger sports cars from Bentley and one-off specials, but no production racing cars until ERA appeared in the late 1930s. Racing in Britain was confined to hill climbs and the speed bowl of Brooklands. The road racing tradition didn't emerge until Donington was opened and the Campbell circuit at Brooklands at about the same time. Alfa Romeo raced their cars in factory teams, so private owners who wanted to compete in the major races of the time had to buy from Maserati. Whitney Straight on a wet day at Shelsley Walsh Hill Climb. Straight held the outright record. Straight was a fine driver who had a short career. The Anglo-American retired from racing before he was 30 and went on, amongst other things, to become boss of the airline BOAC, now known as British Airways, and head of the British Post Office. He wasn't satisfied just driving in British events either, taking it to the continent for hill climbs there as well. Mont Ventoux in France. Notice the twin rear wheels for added traction. Prior to Straight's climb, the record for Mont Ventoux had been held by the four-wheel drive Bugatti, a works car driven by Louis Dreyfus. Meanwhile, the Maserati operation expanded in all directions. The first Maserati Grand Tourer with a Castagna body made its debut at the Milan show in 1931. Count Theo Rossi del Montlera used a Maserati engine in his powerboat, the Montlera 12, which went on to claim the world water speed record. From Maserati's point of view, Whitney Straight's team was a credit to the company, which helped promote their cars very successfully. Here he is again at Brooklands. The Maserati brothers built up their company based on these sales and sales of sports cars to compete in the Mille Miglia and the Targa Florio. At this stage, they weren't building production road cars. Maserati's little cars were winning races on tracks all over Europe, and the brand was rapidly gaining a reputation for advanced engineering. Among its innovations were the world's first hydraulic brakes. After winning the South African Grand Prix at the end of 1934, Whitney Straight retired from racing and sold the Maserati to Harry Rose. He had the engine sleeved down to 2.7 litres to take advantage of current regulations and handicap racing that was then popular. He engaged rising star Richard Seaman to drive, and no one could catch him. It was this drive, and a drive at the wheel of Hans Rusch's Alfa Romeo, that saw Seaman accept an invitation to drive for Mercedes-Benz. The 8CM was then sold to Prince Chula for Prince Bira to drive. The Maserati had been recommended by Louis Chiron and Raymond Sommer, two important French drivers of the era. This race was held at the Campbell circuit at Brooklands, a semi-road circuit which gave an advantage to some of the smaller cars. It's often thought that the Maserati was quicker than the 2-litre ERA of Raymond Mays. However, the ERA had a better power-to-weight ratio and didn't use as much fuel, but the Maserati carried more fuel and Bira was perhaps a smoother driver. The Prince received his unusual prize from Sir Malcolm Campbell. The 1937 Donington Grand Prix with the Mercedes and Auto Union at their peak. Bira was entered in this race with the Maserati and was the first locally entered car home. He finished 6th overall, though so far behind the Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union opposition that he was not officially classified. The reason was that the Maserati was completely outclassed by the much faster German cars. The bookmakers, who fancied Bira and Raymond Mays, ran off after the race, leaving the organising club to pay the shortfall. This race was held for both the new 3-litre Formula and also Voiturette cars. None of the British ERAs were entered, and the main interest centred on the new 3-litre racing cars. Auto Union was not present, so it was Alfa Romeo and Maserati who were to challenge Mercedes in the first big race for the new formula. As Van Brautich and Rudolf Caracciola walked towards the Mercedes, here is the latest 3-litre Alfa Romeo. The 8CTF was a supercharged 3-litre straight-8. If Maserati had the finance of their great rival Alfa Romeo, they undoubtedly would have gone faster and better. From the start, it was Count Trossi who went straight into the lead. He established the fastest lap in the Maserati 8CTF and was running away from the field of Mercedes and Alfa Romeos. Had the car lasted, it could have won. Meanwhile, in the Voiturette category, there were many crashes, costing the life of Hans-Hugo Hartmann together with a serious injury to Giuseppe Farina. Victory to Mercedes-Benz once more. The hat-trick for Hermann Lang, who won Tripoli on every occasion that he entered there. In the German Grand Prix, Maserati didn't enter their two cars, to the relief of Mercedes-Benz and certainly to the benefit of Britain's Richard Seaman, who won the race for Mercedes. In the Voiturette 1.5-litre category, Maserati had a straight fight with ERA, and Alfa Romeo produced the 158, here in its debut race. The domination that the German cars had in Grand Prix racing was forcing the Italians to consider the smaller capacity Voiturette class. Maserati built a new 4-cylinder model, the 4CM, with a choice of either 1500 or 1100cc engines. At the Coppa Acerbo in Pescara in 1938, the two Maseratis acquitted themselves well, although both retired. In the Italian Grand Prix the same year, Trossi finished in 5th place. The Donington Grand Prix of 1938. The Maserati 8CTF was driven by Luigi Villoresi. Nuvolari to drive for Auto Union. Notice the detachable steering wheels. At the start of the race, there was a disappointment for Maserati. Villoresi was late arriving at the circuit and started from the back of the grid, and although in the early laps he made up some ground, the Maserati was an early retirement. Luigi Villoresi and his brother Emilio were fine Italian drivers who came up through the Voiturette school with Maserati. Emilio went on to drive for Alfa Romeo, but lost his life in a crash. Luigi went on to mentor Alberto Ascari, and was a fine driver in his own right. Approaches had been made to Maserati by the wealthy Italian industrialist Adolfo Orsi. He was interested in acquiring all the assets of the Maserati brothers, who were making public transport, machine tools and electrical equipment. These, together with an agricultural machinery business, were extremely successful. Orsi was particularly keen to acquire the very successful Maserati sparking plug business. He also saw the Maserati racing cars bringing him a great deal of prestige. He had the money to expand the competition side of the business, which the brothers didn't have. In 1938, the takeover was complete, and Adolfo's son, Omar Orsi, became managing director. The Maserati business was transferred from Bologna to Viale Ciro Menotti in Modena. And the three surviving brothers entered into a 10-year service agreement with Orsi and stayed with the company until the end of 1947. The 1939 Tripoli Grand Prix. This was the race where the V8 1.5-litre Mercedes-Benz W165 made its debut and took part in its one and only race. The drivers, Rudolf Caracciola and Hermann Lang. The opposition, the 158 Alfa Romeo and the new Maserati 4CL. It was hoped that the 4CL, with its 1500cc 4-valve per-cylinder engine, which developed 220 horsepower, would be able to beat the Alfa 158. Much was expected of the Maserati, which in streamlined form had been fast in practice. But during the race, however, the car was not a contender. The Tripoli Grand Prix was dominated by Mercedes-Benz and Hermann Lang. On the other side of the Mediterranean, ERAs took a rare victory in 1939 at Albi in France. Alfa Romeo's 158. Seen here behind the wheel is Mercedes-Benz designer Rudolf Uhlenhuth. These cars, originally constructed by Enzo Ferrari, had been passed over to Alfa when they decided to field their own team. ERA's new challenger in the Voiturette class was the E-Type, but the company was in disarray. The E-Type met the Maserati 4CL for the first time at Albi. Here, Bira had reverted to his old ERA, Romulus. Johnny Wakefield was at the wheel of the 4CL, and Arthur Dobson driving the ERA E-Type. Dobson led the race, but called into the pits because the engine wasn't sounding good, and unfortunately lost the car and dented the rear end, and he became a retirement. Bira went on to finish in third place, Johnny Wakefield the winner in the 4CL in fine form, almost lapping the Royal Siamese driver. The German Grand Prix of 1939. Notable for two things: Rudolf Caracciolla's final victory in his career and the performance of Paul Pietsch, a discard from Auto Union. Now a successful publisher, he drove his Maserati superbly and could well have won the race but for failing brakes. Eventually, Pietsch went on to finish in third place, but not before he had frightened Mercedes and Auto Union. This was Caracciola's final victory, although he did race after the war. An 8C TF Maserati was entered at Indianapolis, taking on the Offenhauser-powered cars. Renamed the Boyle Special, it was driven by Wilbur Shaw. After replacing an engine after practice, Shaw went on to a comprehensive victory in the 500-mile race. It was the first European car since Peugeot to win at Indy in 1916. When Marshal Balbo presided over Tripoli in 1940, there were no Mercedes or Auto Unions on this occasion. It was a straight fight between Alfa and Maserati. Victory went to Farina with the Alfa Romeo 158, with Villoresi in second place in the Maserati 4CL. Here, the spoils of victory are shared by Farina. At Indianapolis in 1940, it was another victory for Wilbur Shaw. Fire destroyed the pits in 1941, and although the race still took place, unreliability cost Shaw a third win. Louis Dreyfus obtained leave from the French army, which was rather fortunate for him because France was invaded while he was away, and he also drove a Maserati in the 500-mile Classic. The Second World War saw an end to motor racing in Europe and in America after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor in December of that year. Despite the ravages of war and occupation, Maserati managed to preserve their cars. They and Alfa Romeo had a number of cars ready for the restart of motor racing in 1946. There was no longer an official Maserati team as such, but the company was represented by Scuderia of Milano, which had several 4CLs which they entered for a number of leading drivers. In the early races in France and Italy in 1946, the 4CL was competitive, although never quite as quick as Alfa Romeo. The major Grand Prix were contested by Alfa, but nearly everywhere else, Maserati was victorious. Here is Luigi Villoresi winning at Nice in 1946. Over in America, at Indianapolis, the 8CTF Maserati was dusted down and raced to third place in the first post-war 500-mile race in 1946. Tazio Nuvolari at the wheel of a 4CL Maserati, one of his few appearances in a single-seater after the war. Despite driving with his usual verve on this occasion, he wasn't able to win. A new Grand Prix formula was established in 1946. This was for 1.5-litre supercharged or 4.5-litre unsupercharged cars, to the pre-war Voiturette regulations. Racing in Europe was mainly on street and road courses, each race a special occasion held annually. Maserati tried two-stage supercharging on the 8CL. This car was now outlawed by the regulations and won for the last time at Mar de la Plata in Argentina, driven by Farina in 1948. The 4CL had an immensely successful season in 1946. Two great French drivers emerged, Jean-Pierre Vermeulen, seen here at the wheel of an Alfa Romeo, and Raymond Sommer, chasing him with the 4CL. Development potential of the Alfa Romeo was greater than that of the 4CL. Normally, Vermeulen, Farina, Count Felice Trossi and the rejuvenated Achille Varzi were able to win, but they fought amongst themselves pretty hard. Here, Farina was the winner in Geneva. There was another win for Villoresi in Nice. Once again, the 4CL was the master of the minor Grand Prix. The opposition was led by the French Largo Talbots with their low-revving six-cylinder engines. They didn't have the thirst for fuel that the Italian engines had. This is the 1947 Belgian Grand Prix, the first post-war race at the famous Spa-Francorchamps road circuit. Alfa Romeo were victorious here, and the driver that led them home was Jean-Pierre Vermeulen. His experience went back to the early 1930s, and by now he was at the height of his skill and could have been the first world champion. However, 1948 turned out to be a sad year for Alfa. First, the pre-war ace Achille Varzi was killed in the Swiss Grand Prix. This is the French Grand Prix on the very fast Reims circuit, and another win for Vermeulen. British drivers were yet to make their mark in Grand Prix racing, and Reg Parnell was their best driver. His son, 1960s F1 team owner Tim Parnell, remembers the era.
I was still at school, but I still went to one or two interesting motor races with him. One memorable occasion was when the Zandvoort circuit opened in 1949, and the BRDC were invited to organise and to do the race there. And I remember as a small boy going there, and we lived in the barracks at Haarlem. All the mechanics and several of the drivers lived in the barracks at Haarlem. And my father was fortunate to win the first heat at the Zandvoort track. And then the final was a very, very good race between Tony Rolt and Birra. Of course, my father had spun on one of the early laps. And the result was that Birra won by about 1/5 of a second.
Both Birra and Parnell were running 4CL Maseratis. Birra's car still entered by the pre-war Equipe White Mouse stables. Birra and his cousin, Prince Chula Chakrabongse, didn't get on with Parnell.
And yes, there was quite bitter rivalry between Birra and my father. I don't think they really got on very well together, actually. I think that's perhaps one of the few occasions that my father did sort of feel like that about fellow drivers, because he did have a very good personality with regard to other drivers.
The 1948 San Remo Grand Prix saw Maserati introduce their completely revised 4CLT 48. This was the first new model to come out of the Maserati factory since the departure of the Maserati brothers, now that their 10-year service agreement had come to an end. Twin supercharging was standard on this car, which had a power output of 260 brake horsepower. The tubular chassis was developed with coil springs and double wishbone front suspension, but it retained a rigid rear axle on semi-elliptical springs. Maserati had a great year, with Farina winning at Geneva and at Monaco, and Ascari at San Remo. Silverstone opened in 1948, and Reg Parnell won the first race in the 4CLT San Remo. Lining up for the first post-war British Grand Prix: Chiron, Ascari, de Graffenried, Bira, Gerard, and Itassalon. This is the original start-finish line just after Abbey Corner. Among the others taking part, Luigi Villoresi, Reg Parnell, and a young Roy Salvadori. The race was dominated by the 4CLT Maseratis, but the old ERAs were still competitive. Bob Gerard drove a superb race. As the Maseratis raced among themselves and fell by the wayside, the ERA was moving up through the field. Retired and refueled, Maseratis returned to the fray. Eventually, it was Luigi Villoresi who was to take the checkered flag in victory in the first British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Villoresi also won the Swiss Grand Prix, where Achille Varzi and Christian Kautz were killed. Luigi Villoresi's protégé, Alberto Ascari, had finished second in the 1948 British Grand Prix. And while Farina, Bira and Sommer gave Ferrari their first Grand Prix outing, Jean-Pierre Vermeulen was still the driver to beat. In the eyes of the Italians, there is only one circuit race, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. A huge crowd was there in 1948 to watch the blessing of the drivers. Among those present was Tazio Nuvolari, too ill to take part. Another veteran, Luigi Fagioli, was keen to return to racing. The parade of the cars and the flags prior to the start. The 4CLT Maseratis, and a relaxed Vermeulen chats before the start. Count Felice Trossi with the pipe, about to drive his last race. The Italian Grand Prix, a race dominated by Jean-Pierre Vermeulen. His wife times him, and the checkered flag awaits a great driver. Vermeulen receives congratulations. Sadly, he died in an accident in Argentina, and the third Alfa driver, Count Felice Trossi, died of cancer. A new star was on the horizon, Juan Manuel Fangio, picked as a future talent by Achille Varzi. Fangio was already having success in his native Argentina. He'd made a brief visit to Europe in 1948, but in 1949 he was ready to take on the Europeans. Fangio had raced extensively in Argentina prior to the Second World War, in the great town-to-town events that came to a halt when Argentina ran short of fuel. Racing in Europe was a totally different discipline. He started his career in Grand Prix racing with a 4CLT Maserati, provided by the Argentinian Automobile Club. Alfa, saddened by the deaths of their three drivers, withdrew from racing for a year. What was the 4CLT like?
Well, it was rather a brittle car, and I believe the factory only kept it going really because they more or less put new engine blocks into it pretty well about every 3 or 4 races. It was we had a dynamometer installed in Derby, at the garage in Derby, and I remember when they put this engine on the dynamometer and you saw it actually running, the way the oil spurted out from everywhere and the water spurted out from everywhere, it really did look horrendous. It was producing probably about around 300 bhp, but from this 4-cylinder engine, and it did look absolutely horrific on the dynamometer.
The Orsi family, who owned Maserati, had machine tool interests in Argentina, and they wanted Fangio as a driver. Here he is in his very first race in Europe with the 4CLT, taking on Bira at San Remo. Fangio won, and the two drivers became close friends. In his first season in Europe, Fangio took 4 important victories. In 1949, a new name was making its mark in racing: Ferrari. First with a single-stage supercharged V12 and then with a 2-stage supercharged version of the 125. Spa in 1949, and Maserati, Talbot and Ferrari were evenly matched during the year, all taking their fair share of wins. Louis Rossier with a Talbot and Louis Charon, also Talbot, had a fierce battle with Bira's 4CLT and Peter Whitehead's single-stage supercharged Ferrari. The veteran Chiron had won his first French Grand Prix before the war. Ascari drove a Ferrari at Silverstone in 1949, Louis Chiron a Talbot, and this was the Daily Express trophy. The winner, Ascari, was chased all the way by Farina in a special Maserati, and he took the flag, literally. Compared to today's smooth circuits, what was it like to drive on the rougher tracks of the 40s and 50s? Historic racing expert Willie Green.
Some of the circuits then were so bumpy that if you didn't have independent front suspension, it tended to deflect the car and throw it offline. Nowadays we're driving on billiard tables and you don't need suspension, so you really don't need geometry again. It's just like a big go-kart. And the B-Maxwell cars handle a great deal better than any of the cars with independent front suspension.
The 1949 British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Reg Parnell chats to John Eason Gibson, the secretary of the organising club, the BRDC. Here's Villoresi, the winner from last year, looking forward once again to a good run and still with a 4CLT. Bira has arrived in his Maserati sports car and chats to de Graffenried, both of them driving for Enrico Plate. Only one Ferrari was entered, a single-stage short chassis car for Raymond Mays, the very first Van der Velde Ferrari. Prior to the start, the drivers had time to speak to each other and to enjoy life. It was serious when they got out there on the track, but off-track there was fun. Lord Howe about to brief the drivers, Bob Gerrard, and walking away, Raymond Mays on the right of picture. David Murray, later of Ecurie Ecosse, and Roy Salvadori in the black overalls and helmet. They're away for the second British Grand Prix at Silverstone. It turned out to be a very fierce battle indeed at the front of the field between the 4 CLTs. Bira, at the top of his form, putting distance between himself and the opposition. Such distance that team owner Enrico Plate in the pits tried to slow him down. But Bira was pressing hard, anxious to increase his lead before the pit stops. De Graffenried comes in with car number 2. Bob Gerrard in the ERA, and now Bira, flat out, but his brakes were fading. As de Graffenried went back into the race, Bira hit a marker barrel, damaging the car badly. He came into the pits to retire. There was little that Plate and the mechanics could do, so Bira got out of the car and urged de Graffenried to go quicker. Lord Howe talks to a disconsolate Plate. Reg Parnell comes in to retire his Maserati, crash hat off already. He knows his race is run. Into the lead went Baron Emmanuel de Graffenried, the second of the Plate Maserati drivers holding off the assault from the ERAs to take victory. Bira applauds, and Joan Gerard congratulates her husband Bob for third place. Another rising Argentinian star, Jose Froilan Gonzalez in a 4CLT Maserati at the Dutch Grand Prix of Zandvoort, and the refueling stop that went wrong. Fire put out, Gonzalez unhurt, and de Graffenried and Bira finishing second and third. By 1950, Villaresi, Ascari, Fangio and Gonzalez had moved on from Maserati. Prince Bira still had his 4CLT chassis, but fitted with a 4.5-litre Maserati Oscar engine. Oscar was the company run by the Maserati brothers after they had left the Orsi-owned Maserati. Here at Goodwood, without a crash helmet, which wasn't mandatory at non-championship races, Bira was able to see off Parnell. In the autumn of 1950, Bira had to give best to Parnell with a BRM, but here he was able to keep the Derbyshire farmer at bay. The team manager was Tony Rudd, later of BRM, and Bira was acting as more or less his own mechanic. Maserati couldn't afford to take on the Alfas and Ferraris in the new Formula One World Championship and decided to concentrate on building a Formula 2 car, the A6 GCM 2000. Two new cars were built initially. Each A6 GCM used a dual overhead camshaft single ignition engine with 160 brake horsepower, derived from the A6 GCS and on a chassis similar to that of the 4CLT 48. Formula 2 was for 2-litre unsupercharged and 500 supercharged cars. Alfa had dominated Formula 1, but they withdrew at the end of 1951. As there were only Ferrari, some pre-war Talbots and the unreliable BRM available, race organisers decided to make the World Championship for Formula 2 cars. This suited Maserati, who were able to return to racing at the highest level. The change of formula brought a change of car for Fangio. The reigning world champion was now back driving for Maserati. However, Fangio had a bad crash at Monza, which put him out of action for a year, and Alberto Ascari easily won in 1952 and 53 in the Ferrari 500. This is the French Grand Prix at Reims. It was to prove one of the quickest and the most exciting Grand Prix on record. Lap after lap, it was a duel between Mike Hawthorne's Ferrari and Fangio's Maserati. They're about to lap Stirling Moss's Alta. In the final stages, Hawthorne realises that first is the gear to use on the last lap at the hairpin if he is to have maximum acceleration. It had been sticking throughout the race. He reached for it in time, got it, took victory, and his first World Championship win. At Silverstone 2 weeks later, Gonzalez started on half-full tanks, and Fangio drove a superb race, although Ascari was again the winner. Hawthorne was to spin away his chances in front of the grandstands. At the Nürburgring, Ascari lost out for once. A wheel came off his Ferrari after he'd led the race. Victory went to Farina, the 1950 world champion, his last win. Maserati may have lost the championship battle to Ferrari, but in the Italian Grand Prix, they had a long-awaited win. Once again, this was a race-long battle between the Ferrari 500 and the Maserati A6 GCM. A final corner spin saw Fangio win with the Maserati on the circuit that had almost killed him the year before. (1954) saw the greatest Grand Prix Maserati ever, the 250F. And what made it so good?
It's big, it's strong, it was designed to last 300-mile races on bumpy street circuits. The brakes were very powerful. There's nothing wrong with drum brakes as long as they've been set up by somebody who understands them. And I have never had any trouble overtaking anybody in a braking area when they've got disc brakes.
The 250F combined the best from the A6 GCM, the inline six-cylinder engine, dual camshafts and dual ignition, and new developments including a new differential unit with a ZF transmission mounted overhanging in a transverse position, a tubular space frame by Colotti, and a de Dion axle flipped 180 degrees. There were Houdil vane dampers and Barani wheels. There was a heavy demand for the car from private customers. Eventually, 31 of the 250Fs were built. Maserati had cars available for sale, and Stirling Moss was one of the buyers in 1954, and the total cost was £10,000. In 1954, Fangio won in Argentina and Belgium, and then changed to Mercedes when they were ready to start racing in the French Grand Prix. Moss was now invited to join the Maserati Works team after proving his ability. At the Nürburgring, Onofre Marimon was killed in practice and Fangio won. Moss led the Italian Grand Prix in a fight with Ascari, Villoresi and Fangio. Villoresi drove a fantastic race, but he too had to retire, while Moss pushed his car across the line. Fangio went on to victory and his third World Championship. The evolution of the 250F continued in 1955 with the adoption of a new cylinder head, a 5-speed gearbox, a more aerodynamic body, disc brakes and fuel injection. For 1955, Maserati had Jean Beira, an ex-Gordini driver who was not really able to maintain the pace of the top 3 or 4 drivers. Although Maserati won a number of non-championship races, Prince Beira, for example, winning the New Zealand Grand Prix in his final season, it was not a good year for the team. Retirements came aplenty. Mercedes won race after race, but they too retired from motor racing at the end of 1955. Stirling Moss rejoined Maserati for 1956.
The great thing about Maserati is their cars were beautiful to handle. I mean, the Maserati was a much nicer car to drive. A 250F was far nicer than the 196. A 300S sports car was nicer than the SLR. I don't say it wouldn't beat them. It wasn't as reliable, it wasn't as good a car, but the Italians put into a car something of themselves and the beauty of style, and they're such lovely people. I mean, I had in the Mille Miglia, my brake pedal broke off. It could have been a very serious shunt, and I came and showed it to the mechanic, and the guy was sufficiently moved that he cried. And anybody who has that much love for the sport are wonderful people to be working with in something that you love, and therefore the change, although it was from the sublime to the ridiculous, coming from Mercedes and Neubaum, the greatest team in the world without a doubt at the time, and going along to Maestro Ugolini, a Superman, great man on the stopwatches and everything, and good tactician, but with their haphazard ways, if you like, wasn't as big a step as it sounds to those who weren't there, because I was going from one really important thing into something where it was their love, and that was very important.
The first Grand Prix of 1956 was the Argentine Grand Prix in Buenos Aires. Maserati had a new team chief for the race, Ferrari manager Nello Ugolini. Maserati had a strong team with Moss, Beira, Carlos Menditengay and Froilan Gonzalez making a one-off appearance. Ferrari had Fangio, Luigi Musso, Eugenio Castellotti, Olivier Gendebien and Peter Collins, and Fangio went on to win the race. At Monaco in 1956, Stirling Moss drove a magnificent race, almost single-handedly taking on the Ferrari team of Fangio, Collins, Hawthorne, Musso and Castellotti. It was a great victory for Stirling and for Maserati. In 1957, he drove the unique Costin-bodied coupe Maserati 4.5-litre V12 and the open car on a number of occasions. With 3-litre Maserati sports cars, he won a number of races, but here at Le Mans, however, the old Jaguar D-Type saw them all off. Moss continued to drive Maseratis to the end of their career. He's seen here at the Nürburgring in 1956. He won the Italian Grand Prix, helped over the line by fellow Maserati driver Luigi Piotti. Although Fangio won the title with Ferrari, the Argentinian moved back to Maserati for 1957. He arrives at the Modena circuit in early 1957 to try out the latest version of the 250F. In this unique onboard film from the 1950s, we ride with and listen to the maestro at work. Fangio got the season off to a great start by winning the Argentine Grand Prix for a 4th time. At Monaco, all the Maserati team drivers tested the new V12 engine 250F, but decided to drive their 6-cylinder cars in the race. Stirling Moss had joined Van Wall and led away from Hawthorn and Collins in Ferraris and Tony Brooks in his Van Wall. Moss missed his braking point on lap 4 at the chicane. Wooden poles came across the track, which Peter Collins ran into. Fangio avoided the trouble, but Mike Hawthorn tapped Brooks and ended up on top of Collins's car, so the 3 British stars were out of the race. Fangio went on to win, with Tony Brooks in second. Hawthorn, Collins and Moss walk back to the pits. Brooks was tiring at the end, leaving the way open for an easy Fangio win. Eventually, the Maserati V12 engine did find success in the 1960s with John Surtees in the Cooper, and he won the 1966 Mexican and the 1967 South African Grand Prix. Fangio at the German Grand Prix of 1957. This is the race where he came into the pits to stop for fuel. A leisurely wheel change took place. Fangio climbed out, had a drink, climbed back in again, and then proceeded to show everybody why he won the World Championship 5 times. He caught and passed Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorn. He drove, in his own words, as he never had at any time in his career, to take victory and his 5th World Championship. By 1958, Maserati were being overtaken by the Ferrari, Van Wall and the new breed of rear-engined Coopers. Fangio's last race was in the 1958 French Grand Prix, in the Piccolo, a lightweight version. He was in a battle for second, but after a pit stop with gear selection troubles, finished 4th. Bob Drake raced in the 1960 US Grand Prix at Riverside. The 250F was the only car to race in the first and last races of the 2.5-litre era. The cost of running a works team, the costs of developing the sports car V8 engine, and unpaid bills due to the downfall of the Perón government in Argentina made Maserati's financial position difficult, and the Orsi family closed the racing section, leaving just the sounds of the 250F. A limited return came with sports cars in the 1960s, but the glory days of racing were over. Maserati is now owned by Ferrari and still operates from Modena, concentrating on grand touring cars and continuing their long tradition in motorsport.